Hi, this is Chris.
This is Randall
And we're Chris and Arts and Entertainment with Chris
with
and
Chris and
Randall.
Randall.
And this is a small segment called Chris's Take on Arts and Entertainment, where I pick on something that has caught my eye that I want to talk about. And I'll talk about it for a little bit, and then Randall will ask me some questions. And if you can't tell, if I haven't already said it like in every single episode, or just by the sound of my voice, I'm from New York City. And when you're growing up in New York City, one of the weirdest things you get to enjoy is you get to think you're at the center of the universe. And you think you're the center of the universe because every time you go to the movies or you read a comic book or you watch a TV show, there's always something literally down the street from you. In fact, when I was a kid, there was a movie called Superfly. And there's a scene in the movie that was filmed in our living room growing up. So I had a next door neighbor. She was an actress in a soap opera. So I'd turn on the TV and I'd see my next door neighbor on the TV set. And then I'd step outside, she'd still be there. So your sense of reality is very bent. But I think because I was a kid and I would see like my own neighborhood in movies while I'm in the movie theater, I just assumed that the world was a very small place and everybody on planet Earth lived in New York City. But I started to notice, I think really when I went away to college in the Midwest, and I was finally, for the first time in my life, really living outside of New York City. And I would start to watch movies and TV shows in the rooms in the dorms with my buddies, most of whom were not from New York. And I'd start to realize like most people have never been to New York City. So I was constantly pointing out things like, no, that's not right. Like, that's not a real New York set, or no, you would never do that. Or I'd point out something very small that only a New Yorker would get. So this weekend, I am with my girlfriend and we watched two movies. One that took place on there's a movie that came out right now called Bad Education, which is about Long Island in the early 2000s and a scandal that happened in the public school system. And Hugh Jackman and Allison Janney are in it, as is Ray Romano. And I love Hugh Jackman. And he's doing his best to have a Long Island accent, but it just never quite gels. And I love Allison Janney, and she's overdoing a Long Island accent. It's almost like a Saturday Night Live sketch. And there's Ray Romano, who really is from Long Island, who's just being Ray Romano. And I find immediately like it grades on me the comical or the off-putting. But then I'm also trying to explain to my girlfriend why, in Long Island, what public school your town has is very important because everybody's tax base in Long Island is based on that's probably true everywhere in the world. And then I'm trying to explain to her that Long Island is connected to New York City, but not part of New York City, but you can't get to. And then I'm trying to explain to her that we're seeing one element of Long Island, which is a very middle-class suburban part of Long Island, but the Hamptons are further up the road, and that's a very different Long Island. And then I find myself trying to explain to her that if you get further out on Montauk Point, it's just farmland. And I get it that sooner or later, as I'm talking, I don't even know if anything I'm saying is really necessary for you to enjoy the show. But then they talk about like what airport he's going to use. And they're like, are you going to fly out of Kennedy or Newburgh? And I'm like, Newburgh? No. You're going to fly out of Kennedy or Islip? Not Newburgh. You'd never go to Newburgh. I said, well, have you ever flown out of Islip? Of course. But I realized that you cannot watch things that take place in New York City or in the tri-state area as a New Yorker with the same casual nature that if you're not from these places, you can. And the stuff that I like the most is obviously the stuff that's like spot on. But then I watched a romantic comedy yesterday with her that was showing romantic comedy in New York. And like, no one in New York really has so much money that they can live like that. Or that place that looks like a prop, no, that's real. So what am I saying here? Oh, and my last point, which really pisses me off, which is because I live in Los Angeles. So there's a part of downtown Los Angeles where they use the tall buildings are. And they always, anytime you see a movie like The Avengers or anything where there's a fight scene in New York City or an action scene in New York City, you'll see buildings from New York City. And then they'll cut to this little part of either Culver City or downtown LA that I know for a fact where it is. And it pisses me off. So my hot button, and I guess it'll always be, is either things are so New Yorky that only a New Yorker can get it, or things are so fake New Yorky that it's propagating a myth of New York that I want to tell everyone doesn't exist. And I think I'll always have this problem. So that's my rant. You got some questions for me, please?
All right.
Randy?
Yeah. Well, it was very interesting. I mean, I always got the impression growing up watching stuff set around New York, East Coast area, especially anywhere in the East Coast. There was always like this assumption that people knew the geography of what was going on. I mean, because I guess most people in the country live on the East Coast somewhere, and New York is huge. I mean, New York's got a lot of people. So I guess my question, what is so irritating to you about it? I mean, is it just they get the geography wrong, or
I think it's any false note. Any false note pisses me off because I think I get very upset that people like yourself who have never been to well, you have been, but people who've never been to New York City and may never go to New York City, or they'll go to New York City only with the knowledge that they have, will believe this to be true when it isn't. Now, it's hysterical because the other city that I always knew about growing up from movies and TV was Los Angeles. So when I arrived to LA, 99% of everything I thought about Los Angeles was what I learned from watching movies and TV. So I was as much a misguided visitor to LA as most of you folks are who come to New York City.
did
I'm going to
anything?
go to the beach and get a taco.
Well, did anything surprise you about the Southern California area when you came here?
Oh, it's taken me literally half of a lifetime to really understand that the Los Angeles that I see in movies and TV and the Los Angeles that I live with is exactly like the New York City I see in film and television. Some of it is very real and very true, and some of it is very fake and very untrue. And I guess in art, you can only approximate reality. You can't actually convey reality. It's not a documentary. So the choices that they make to make Los Angeles or New York City look or feel a certain way because it serves the story, it bothers me, but that may be the only way to do it. Or at least that's the way that they choose to do it. It upsets me, no.
Why does it upset you?
Because it's not the real experience, and because I have had the real experience, it becomes propaganda.
Well, how does somebody get the real experience? Going on Google Street View, maybe?
I guess to be honest with you, and this is true, I guess if you like films from England, you love London. Another place that I remember going to only with the knowledge I had gotten from film and TV, or Las Vegas. I guess every place I've ever gone to that is a major point of destination, whether it's Las Vegas or Paris or London or Chicago, it always comes in with what I've learned from TV and film for the most part. So there's always going to be a disconnect between what I expect and what I see. And I'm sure, friends of mine pointed out to me when they saw it when Harry Met Sally, that they're on the Eisenhower Freeway and they're going in the wrong direction. So everybody in Chicago could pick that up. And it's like when people walk, 20 blocks in 1 minute in Harry Met Sally, like that could not happen.
Well, we both do photography, and one thing I've learned doing photography, this is a picture. Both of these pictures are ones we took, and one thing I've learned is framing is everything, right? I mean,
Yeah.
when I look at locations on movies and TV that I've been to, I can see how the photographer has framed it, and they've definitely almost always have framed it in a way that can be misleading. That probably is misleading, and
do you ever feel obligated to tell people, hey, this is not the truth?
You mean with my photography or with other people's photography?
With your photography, like if someone said, Randall, that's an amazing
with my
photo.
photography,
you
no.
Say, well, I cropped it. I like right behind it right now it looks like you and I are outside when we're not outside.
Well, look, with my photography, no, because I am kind of obsessed with trying to capture reality in photography.
Well, then with other
And
people's photography.
with other people's photography, it's like any other art. It's like when I evaluate art, I'm trying to understand what the artist is trying to express, what their intention is. Okay, and I know that's not a very postmodern thing to say, but you know, I think the postmodernists are wrong about artist's intention. But yeah, when I evaluate art, I'm looking for the artist's intention, and most of the time I can see why they did what they did. Okay, why they cropped it, it's misleading, because they're using the location as raw material for their art. You know, it's like if you're shooting, uh, like I remember there was a film professor I had who talked about how in Dirty Harry, you know, the cinematographer made San Francisco look dirty and gritty and ugly, when
Yeah.
San Francisco is one of the most beautiful cities in the world. And uh, so yeah, so the cinematographer goes into San Francisco and finds the dirtiest, ugliest parts of San Francisco, puts only those parts in the frame, and because they're trying to accomplish something, you
Well,
know,
you just
trying to
you
achieve
reminded
something
you reminded me of
artistically.
something that actually is very weird and strange. So I remember watching last year The Joker, and The Joker is filmed mostly in New York City.
Yeah, what'd you
And
think about that?
well, two things. First off, I was really impressed by the fact that they were able to find so much of New York City. I mean, there's a little bit where they really had to kind of use old cars, and they had to make Times Square look a little bit more like the old Times Square. But with the exception of like this, and they did a great job, by the way, of making new Times Square look like old Times Square. But 90% of the film is, for the most part, the actual buildings and architecture, subways and streets of contemporary New York. But they found something in it. They did something that was pretty cool, which is they made it look like New York in the past. They made it into a fictional city of Gotham. And uh, I thought it was one of the most authentic actual films of New York City, because even though New York was doubling for the role of Gotham, uh, and even though it was supposed to be in the 70s or 80s, it conveyed a very real part of New York City that exists today in the buildings and the architecture, uh, that no one ever shows in contemporary film. So actually, the Joker's like the opposite of, say, the Sex and the City TV series, you know, or a Woody Allen movie where everybody is only living on the Upper East Side and is white. You know, it showed a certain kind of New York City that's been there all my life. And, you know, Gotham City was created by Bob Kane, who grew up in New York City. And a lot of the artists for the Batman who drew New York City were artists who lived in New York City. So, you know, even the idea that Gotham should look like New York City always has made sense to me, because Gotham has always been New York City. It's a perfect double, as opposed to when you normally watch a Batman movie and it's either a billion sound stages, or it's like the Christopher Nolan films where he would take Chicago, New York, Pittsburgh, and Los Angeles and make them into an amalgamated city.
Well, I guess I want to say something about that, because you made me think of it. I think the Joker movie was shot for a relatively limited budget. And when you see like low budget movies, B movies, amateur photography, uh, low budget stuff, low budget art, they're much less likely. It does become more authentic to the location, right? Because they're much
Yeah.
less likely to close off streets and like have a decorator come in and fix up the building, you know, give the building a treatment. I mean, this is what the Hollywood movies do, right? They come in, they give the building they do
Yeah.
treatments. They hose down the streets for every shot with water. I think the Joker did that, but but
But
they
it
hose
but
down.
it still has the raw ugliness or the real feel of the city as it looks, as opposed to being a little gussied up. Is
Yeah,
that
I
what you're
mean,
saying?
yes, I'm saying that like uh with low budget, there seems to be more authenticity in low budget, in because they don't have the money to achieve their artistic vision, right? So
No,
they just
it's very
accept.
true. Like if you look at any low budget film that takes place in New York City, I've often found that the low budget films of New York City, whether they take place in modern New York City or they take place, like there's a great film by Paul Mazursky called What Next Stop Greenwich Village, filmed in the 70s but takes place in the 50s. but Paul Mazursky also did a film called Moscow on the Hudson, which was filmed in the early 80s and took place in New York City in the early 80s. And again, he's not a guerrilla filmmaker. He's got a budget. It's just not a large budget, but those movies do a much better job than the superhero movies, which probably, for the most part, with the exception of the Joker, show the most artificial New York City you could possibly see.
I'm reminded there's a chase scene in The French Connection where the director later said they just went out on the street and shot it. And
William
it's
Friedkin,
one of the Friedkin. It's one of the greatest chase scenes you've ever seen in a movie ever, and
I
probably
would say
the greatest.
French Connection is one of the greatest New York City movies ever made because, and I remember listening to the director's cut. They just used real location. Every shot, every interior, every exterior. They don't use sound stages. They're just using real locales, and some of them are the exact locales in which the story was based on. Some of the background actors are cops, ex-convicts. It gives you such much more of a sense of what that New York was at the time. And I think I've always, I made a slight digression, but as I get older, I realize I love movies and TV shows with a lot of exterior shots because I like to have a true sense of place when I watch a TV show. And I hate sound stages, and I hate shows where it's almost all interiors and a few establishing shots. Because I really think, for me, part of what's good narrative isn't just actors, but the actual environment itself. You know, like a show, not New York, but I'm going to pick on it right now. Everyone's watching is, say, Ozark. But Ozark is outdoors a lot. They use a lot.
Well, have you noticed that's a trend in the Netflix properties? They almost every new Netflix project that they're putting money into, that they're producing themselves, they choose a part of the country or the world to shoot it in first, it seems like. And then
But I will say this much about Ozark. So Ozark.
But it gives you that authenticity, is my point.
It does,
like what you're talking about.
But here's the point, and it's the last point I'm going to make. Ozark is supposed to take place in Missouri, right? Missouri. And you always see them on the lake, and there's this beautiful lake in Missouri. And I'm watching it with my girlfriend, and she tells me, that's in Atlanta. So even Ozark doesn't actually, it commits the same problem. And God love my girlfriend. She just lets that thing go and doesn't say another thing, and we continue to watch the show. But she's a lot better adapted at watching places like Atlanta, which is constantly being used for everything but Atlanta. Whereas I feel like
has a burgeoning industry there, yes.
Right. So that's all I have to say. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Chris.
Randall.
Be well, be safe. And this is Arts and Entertainment, Chris's Take with Chris and Randall. Bye.